Former educator and retired federal employee, she served as speechwriter for the heads of 3 government agencies and as editor-in-chief of NASA's newspaper at the Johnson Space Center. Today, she is a Washington, D.C.-based freelance writer, the author of 5 books, and a frequent keynote speaker on the lecture circuit. Her most recent work is Walking Targets: How Our Psychologized Classrooms Are Producing a Nation of Sitting Ducks. Today, we welcome Beverly Eakman. We live in an information age, but it is not so benign or ideal as it sounds. What does the collection of information have to do with such things as psychiatry, social control, and the negation of individuality? Find out in today's show with author and educator Beverly Eakman. Hello, America, and welcome to Watchdog Radio. I'm your host, J.C. McKinley, and my guest today is Beverly Eakman. Beverly taught in public schools for 9 years, starting in 1968. She was a science editor and writer at NASA. In 1977, she wrote a technical piece for Roundup, the official newspaper of NASA, called David the Bubble Baby. Beverly has worked as a chief speechwriter at a number of national organizations and federal agencies, including the Commission on the Bicentennial for the U.S. Constitution. She has written several books, including Cloning of the American Mind, Eradicating Morality Through Education. Her latest book is Walking Targets: How Our Psychologized Classrooms Are Producing a Nation of Sitting Ducks. Okay, folks, here's what we're talking about today. Information is being collected from us during the normal course of our lives by going to buy books from Amazon, by surveys that we might fill out in a magazine. And this information may be being stored and may ultimately be compiled into a dossier that could be used against us. The point is, you don't know on a specific piece of information that you release about yourself where that data is ultimately headed. And if you take a mental health screening survey that asks you questions, which right now could be for the purpose of diagnosing you with a so-called mental disorder, that information could be stored and then compiled into a dossier in the future that could be used against you. And that's what our guest is talking about today. Hello, Beverly Eakman, and welcome to the show.
Hello there.
It's nice to have you with us.
My pleasure to be on.
Now, let me just ask my first question here. Is the information collected about our students being used to mold political opinions?
Definitely at this point. And that's the thing that's going to get us all in the end. The drugs simply follow. Any student that is not having the correct opinion, shall we say, that will essentially be called mental illness. And that, of course, is followed with drugging, as we now know, even from adults. The first line of defense, even in nursing homes, is to start giving people Celexa and different antidepressants and other opinion molding, or I should say, it is opinion molding, but other psychiatric drugs which wind up being opinion molders too.
And how does this start? What's the procedure or the process that they are using to collect this information?
Well, since 9/11, you may recognize much of this mental health screening by another name, data mining. But data mining actually started in the schools back in the early 70s when it was called psychographics by professionals. Psychographics sort of morphed into behavioral profiling and now data mining. And thanks to computerization, which I guess took off even better than ever predicted by the people who were working on the stuff, it surprised even them. It has facilitated essentially what we know as dossier building inside and outside the school setting. And I got hold of several very heavy documents under the National Center for Education Statistics, and really, they before they shut me out, But it even said one of the titles of the documents was called Data Mining Journals and Books Using the Science of Networks to Uncover the Structure of Educational Research. So that's when I knew absolutely that I had been on target with my first book in 1991. That's when I initially predicted what was going to happen, because they were already starting, government was already starting to slip in psychological questions into bona fide academic tests. And I guess the first one I ever saw was in Pennsylvania, and it was called the Educational Quality Assessment, but it was 61% personality profile. Now, that's a lot. That's more than half. And they were definitely psychological questions, which most people, if they thought about it, could pick out which ones were and which ones weren't. But now, it's like, data mining on steroids. I mean, it's psychological profiling on steroids, I guess I should say. I mean, they're even collecting things from Amazon, for example, the online book.
And they're putting it all together in one place?
Well, what they do is you don't have to have one humongous big computer, as long as you have lots of small ones talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened. There's an organization called the Council for Chief State School Officers.
Mm-hmm.
It's been around, since, I guess, the early 70s. Well, by 1974, they were being asked to go around to the different states and encourage them with monetary incentives to get their computers compatible with federal ones. And at the time, it seemed pretty, benign,
mm-hmm.
and that there wasn't much wrong with it. But as time went on, they called it an assessment, a way of improving assessments and coordinating them so that they could compare data.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that sounded sensible enough until you realized that the word assessment was being used as a replacement for test. They don't use the word test anymore, and the reason is an assessment is not a test.
Mm-hmm.
They are assessing your opinions, and various other things, your state of so-called mental health,
mm-hmm.
And so forth. And then they're using interactive computer-based tasks, and now I'll have to explain to you later because it does work into this, but you start getting heavily technical. And that's kind of been the thing I've been on now for a number of years because it is so technical that you kind of have to spend all your time on it
mm-hmm.
to figure it out. But they first got an organization in Utah called WICAT for short. It's a World Internet Assisted Computer for Technology. And WICAT, I think I'm not saying it quite right. I'll have to look it up again. But the head of it was named Dustin Houston. And he made the statement, won't it be wonderful when no one can get between that computer and that child? We are astounded to know, or to figure out, I think is what he said, that we can have essentially what would be called the 10 top psychologists in the nation interacting with one child, with every child. And then he followed that with, won't it be wonderful when no one can get between that child and that computer? That's when I realized what was going on.
Right. Let me fill in the audience a little bit. When you have profiles being made of kids, when they're being asked questions like, where one question, do you sometimes feel a lack of confidence? And then this question perhaps gets you diagnosed with social anxiety disorder and leads to you being drugged for this. When you have the children forced to be involved with the psychologist, what that can lead to is labeling of the child with a label that'll follow him his whole life, drugging of the child for a made-up disorder, a made-up disease, where there's nothing physically proven to be wrong with him, but because he's got this label, now he is drugged by the psychiatrists. And it also opens the door to the child, the damage of the child being told that there's something wrong with him. This label can have a child come home and say, guess what? I'm sick. I'm diseased. I have something wrong with me. All outside of the parent's control, because this was done in a standard fashion to every child in the school, and the parent may not know about it. And that's what we're talking about here.
It's worse than that, because most parents, unfortunately, are clueless about this. For instance, if they have behavioral issues or even disciplinary issues, which, let's face it, every single parent in the world has a discipline problem with their child at some point in time.
Sure.
That's what discipline is for heaven's sake.
Right.
So if the child acts up in school at all for any reason, or even a perceived reason by the teacher, it might not even be a real reason, if he's antsy one day, if he kicks his foot back and forth, in an irritating fashion, clicks his pen up and down, how people do sometimes.
Right.
And there's no particular reason for it. They just have a day where they're off a little bit, and so they're clicking their pen, and it irritates the teacher. That can set off a referral now to a psychiatrist, whereas, long ago the teacher would have just said, would you cut it out, please? Now they send them to the psychiatrist, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with them. By the way, here's the name of that institute, WICAT. It's World Institute for Computer-Assisted Technology. I just said it.
Okay, and again, what are they doing?
And that is, it's in Utah, and that was one of the first organizations to get this whole act together of working with not just children, but anybody, in other words, computer-assisted technology, what we now know as, when you go into a hospital, immediately you see every body at the nurse's station typing stuff into a computer.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly it's for billing and not really relevant to the patient, but they can put anything in that. I mean, I have even noticed if I get a prescription at the pharmacy, of course, there's these HIPAA laws now, this Privacy Act stuff.
Right.
To stand behind, they go through this big silly thing where you have to sign now and you have to stand so many paces behind the person in front of you and XYZ. Well, what happens is when I get home, now, if it's an unusual prescription, and that's why I noticed one of my prescriptions is very, a little bit off the beaten path because I'm allergic to so many things. And I found in my spam filter a question from a Canadian pharmacist asking me if I didn't want the same thing cheaper.
Wow.
That's 20 minutes it took to hack in to a pharmaceutical computer. Now, that is computer-assisted technology, so you understand the term.
Yeah.
And it goes a lot of different ways. I mean, if somebody wanted to ask me, well, is everybody falling into this dossier thing? Is everybody being assessed every minute of every day, right now, today, every child? No, they aren't. Because, it would be too expensive, and B, it's not necessary. Point is, if you ever run for public office, if you go into a field, like a child going into college, and he wants to pursue a field that might lead to a position of leadership and influence, such as journalism or teaching, he's going to be bumped out if his opinions aren't correct. Now, when I say politically correct today, of course, people tend to think, oh, well, that's just, conservatives talking about liberal political correctness. But that could change overnight.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter which side does it. Once the technology exists, you aren't going to uninvent it.
Right. Now, what are the various sources, what are the various inputs where the data is being collected?
Okay, like I said, one of the biggest shocks to me was to find that book orders from Amazon.com and other online bookstores were being fed into this computer, and on the left, they had left, in other words, liberal,
mm-hmm.
and on the right, they had conservative. In the middle, they had those that could go either way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that means, it was a huge list, and that means that all that can be applied to you if they want to. Another one was it was called a countrywide assessment by gender and friendships by gender
mm-hmm.
in high school. Well, they had this data thing, which, by the way, it's on my website. It got picked up by Vital Speeches of the Day,
mm-hmm.
and anybody who wants to can go onto my website at that Vital Speeches place on links of interest.
Okay, and what's the website again?
www.beverly, that's Beverly with an extra E on it,
mm-hmm.
.com.
Okay.
And then go into links of interest, and you'll see Vital Speeches right at the top, because I won it was Speech of the Month.
Okay.
And they not only put it in the print version, they put it in the online version. And that's good for you guys, because the online version has these exhibits.
Ah.
You can see them yourself.
There you go.
It's your mouth falls open. That's all you can say.
Well, what do parents need to know to protect their children?
Well, first they need to teach them what is private and what isn't, because in the age of Oprah and Geraldo and whatever, kids really don't know. Back in my day and time, when I was a child, if a person came in and said, "Oh, that's a lovely couch, how much did you pay for it?" my mother would have said, "Excuse me?"
Right.
Not today. Nobody thinks that's weird. They're putting questionnaires in 17 magazine, and that's one that, all teenagers pick up starting at 13. And they're asking them very personal questions. Sexual questions and other questions. One of them was, do you, and I'm not going to use the actual term they use because it really isn't very nice, but do you go to the bathroom in the shower? Do you ever go to the bathroom in the shower?
Right.
And they say, okay, fill all this out and send it in. The kids have no idea that that's being tallied. They think it is completely anonymous.
And I guess once it's out of your hands, you don't know where it goes.
That's it exactly. Because at that sheet at the bottom, there's a code on it. And the kid doesn't even pick up on stuff like that. And the same is true of another thing that I found. And again, I got it from the National Center for Education Statistics, but it was called Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, and it was a father's questionnaire. But there's also one for mothers and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I show the whole thing to this audience, the speech,
mm-hmm.
and I got to tell you, it had the most personal question was, when did you first hold your child? And the choices are 1 hour, 3 hours, 1 day because my child was in intensive care. Or they have, you're being assessed on this. When you argue with your spouse, is it over money? Is it over sex? Is it over this? Is it over that?
Mm-hmm.
And it goes on and on for 15 pages. Okay, The reason they are so hot to get every kid in an early childhood program is because that's state-run. And if it's state-run, they're getting money also from the feds because it trickles down.
Mm-hmm.
It goes from the feds, and then a little bit goes to each participating state, which is namely all of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there may be one or two that have opted out, but I don't think there's many anymore because they all want and need the money.
Mm-hmm.
So I was showing the, and this is on the website too, this particular one.
The BeverlyE.com.
Right, BeverlyE.com. I think it's J1.
Okay.
But it's Exhibit J1. But I was showing this to the audience, and I said, all right, here's the cover sheet. What can you tell from the cover sheet? And, of course, everyone's totally clueless.
Mm-hmm.
On the top, there is a blank box. On that top right. On the top left, there is a number. It says OMB, and then there's a number. No one knows what OMB is unless they've worked for government.
Mm-hmm.
Office of Management and Budget.
And what's that doing on this form?
Yeah. And then on the bottom of every sheet of the 15 pages, there's a barcode. Now, why would there be a barcode?
Sounds like it's headed towards being compiled.
Yes. It's an identity of which version each father, in this case.
Uh-huh.
It's the same thing on assessment tests for kids. People don't know. In fact, some of them are on the binder. I mean, like when you rip it apart,
Mm-hmm.
they're right in there where the child wouldn't necessarily see it.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't until you pull the pages apart that you see it. I mean, this stuff is pretty bad.
Now, what sort of tests are the kids being given that might get them labeled with a so-called disorder from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual?
It would most likely be in health class
Mm-hmm.
or social studies, one of those two. And that's where they ask the most personal questions. And, of course, there's lots of personal questions. I've given them many, many times. Some of them are true-false. I often feel uncomfortable in school.
Mm-hmm.
I often feel put down by my friends.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that I would be I can convince people of things by persuasion. I'm good at that, that kind of thing. So that's true, false. Then there is all kinds of other questions that are multiple choice. There's a club at school called the Midnight Artists.
Mm-hmm.
They go around at night painting funny sayings on buildings. I would join the club when I knew, A, my best friend had joined, B, the most popular kids in school were in the club, or C, my parents would ground me if they found out I joined. Now figure that one out. Which one? I mean, you talk about a fishing expedition. There's nothing for I wouldn't join the club.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, you got to pick one. So it turns out I got hold of the measurement, the preferred answers, in other words,
Mm-hmm.
for these things. And the preferred answer was B. The most popular kids were in the club. I wonder why that is. So I had to go hunting through everything under the sun, and I found out it was because that indicated the child would conform to group goals, not individual, nothing for himself, but would conform to group goals.
And what happens if you give the wrong answer?
Then there's a little check mark. There's a little red flag. And one red flag isn't going to hurt anything. 2 or 3 or 4 will. For example, one of the questions which you would not think would be appropriate for a school at all, well, none of them are appropriate to school, but the real shocker was religious affiliation. Now, there were over 700 data elements. I got to tell you, 700. So I had to skip, most of them. But on one of the downloads that people will find on the speech, they will see that on number 30 there is religious affiliation. Well, that's supposed to be off limits for educators. I mean, they aren't even supposed to put up red and green paper at Christmas time. So out of curiosity, I focused on religious affiliation, and you'll never guess what came up.
What?
Well, they had selections of every single religion, I guess, known to man. Calvinism, Nazarene, Pentecostal. I mean, some 29 religions. The teachers aren't even supposed to mention religion. So how is it that they are putting a check mark by some kid's religion? And how do they find that? Well, they're doing it by micro-targeting. In other words, they ask questions that are leading questions and that finally get the child to answer the question in an unexpected way. I mean, they're getting so good at this stuff.
And to clarify...
1980, not like the one I saw from Pennsylvania back in 1980, I guess it's 86.
Right. Now, this test, this assessment that you were looking at, who was making the kids take it, and where was it being taken?
National Center for Education Statistics, and that's federal.
Okay. And who was taking this test or this assessment?
It's state kids. What they do is the minute a local school, I don't care if it's private or public, but in a state, accepts state money, then they're in effect accepting federal money. And a lot of times they don't even realize what they're doing. For example, suppose some guy comes into a private school and passes himself off as just, he's trying to make sure that the school is up to snuff and up to standards. And he says, you know what, you don't have enough handicapped bathrooms here. And it's a private school, and they say, hey, we don't have any more money. We don't, we have one here, and that's it, and we don't have, Oh, and they say, oh, we'll be glad to lend you the money. Bang. You are entrapped right there.
Because now that you have a federal loan...
Right, state money, which really is federal money. The state essentially doesn't really have the money. The feds are targeting the state and say, okay, the state education agencies, you have a U.S. Department of Education, and then you have a state Department of Education. I mean, Utah or Maryland Department of Education, or Michigan or whatever. And many people call it State Education Agency, but it means the same thing as the State Department of Education. So what happens is every state gets something because they apply for it. So if an individual school declines, and some private schools do, some religious schools do, but there are mighty, mighty powerful entities that think, gee, for example, we need a reading program that's equal to what the public schools get at least. Isn't federal government giving some money to our little school, our religious school for reading or for vouchers, which sounds perfectly legitimate and it sounds right, except then you're trapped.
Well, and you say they're trapped because then they have to they have to assess the kids?
That's right.
And is this they have to assess the kids or they won't get future money or they'll have to pay the loan back immediately?
They have to assess or they won't get future money. Now, sometimes they wait a couple of years and let them get suckered in first. But most of the time it's pretty quick. But what happens is they get dependent on the money. And as soon as they're dependent, like, okay, they've hired 4 special education teachers. Well, special education, as you know, is a real holding tank for kids, and most of the kids in there are drugged psychologically because they don't have any knowledge of how to specially help any kid. Yes, it can be done. Learning centers all around the country are, in fact, helping kids that really need special help. But it is not in special education in the public schools and most private schools. Most parents have to send their kids to private learning centers, which in essence are tutorial institutions.
Mm-hmm.
It's not for the whole day. It's just for, certain hours.
Mm-hmm.
So that is not included. So what happens is the kid goes into special education and they hire some special education teachers, and they're paid for with state money, i.e. federal money. And then, oh my gosh, you're going to cut that off? All the kids that are in special education, you see, the way they word it is they're eligible. The word eligible makes it sound good. So the parent thinks, what? My kid isn't eligible anymore? What? You're going to fire these special education teachers and my kid will have to go back into a regular classroom? Horrors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what they need, is to go back into the regular classroom. I mean, you talk about surreptitious.
Okay, so to recap, we're coming towards the end of the show here. To recap, there are several sources of information that are being pulled from citizens in America, in some cases when the citizens are in school. And ultimately, all this information will be combined, collected, available in one place because of the advanced technology that we're in now. The fact that we have the internet and the fact that once the data is compiled and once the data exists, it'll sit there potentially forever and ultimately find its way together into a dossier on you.
That's right, because you cannot prove that you have purged anything in a computer. How are you going to prove that?
Right.
There's no backup. And the other thing is they have something called unique ID. I found it in Nebraska. The states are serving as the fall guys in case a parent complains. Unique ID is the state number for a kid, but they don't realize it goes up to the feds.
Mm.
I found another document, and again, this is on that speech, that says it has a question. Is it cross-matched with the Social Security number? And the answer has to be yes.
Oh.
So guess what? Unique ID is cross-matched with the kid's Social Security number, which he now gets very early on or at birth.
Right. I understand that you have to have a Social Security number in order to take the child as a dependent on your tax return. Well, thank you very much, Beverly. This is all very interesting. Folks, we've been speaking to Beverly Eakman, who taught in public schools for years, and her most recent book is Walking Targets, How Our Psychologized Classrooms Are Producing a Nation of Sitting Ducks. Is there anything you'd like to summarize for the audience?
Well, I guess the only other thing is that predictive algorithms, and that's predictive mathematical things that are in the computer, they predict how a person will probably react, say, 5 years down the road to hot-button issues. That's where this thing is going to really get us. It's already doing it. They already know how to do it, and that's what they're doing with the data.
Wow. Well, thank you for telling us about that. Okay, folks, this has been Watchdog Radio. I'm your host, J.C. McKinley, and this has been our guest, Beverly Eakman. Thank you very much, Beverly, and we'll talk to you again soon.
It was my pleasure.
All right. Bye now.